Now let me introduce a little bit for Karen Storey, today our honor speaker. Karen is the president and the co-founder for the Interactive Training, which provides public speaking training for insurance and banking professionals, as well as individuals and state agencies, such as Johns Hopkins University, Provident Bank, and Department of Human Resources of State of Maryland. Karen is an experienced communication and leadership skill trainer. She has been a keynote speaker for hundreds of conventions and provided public speaking training for over 15 years. Also, as a Johns Hopkins alumni, as well as Toastmaster member for over 24 years. Now, let's welcome Karen Storey. Thank you.
My mother writes my introductions. We've got a big job ahead of us today, so before I go into my material, I have 12 principles for a powerful presentation. I have a question for you. Have you ever said anything that after you said it, you had regrets? Give me a head nod. So you've had words leave your mouth and you thought, wow, did I really say that out loud? Have you had that experience? Or have you ever left a meeting and thought to yourself, if I should have said this, that was the perfect line? Well, I learned a valuable lesson, very, very valuable in my career, and very valuable that I want to share with you, because it happened when I was much younger. You mentioned in my introduction, I've been a Toastmaster for 20-some years. It's because I love the organization, and I feel like I cannot get enough practice when it comes to communication skills. But you have to realize that they allowed me to join when I was 8 years old. So you can do the math. So I need to take you back when I was in my 20s. And I don't know about you, but when I was younger, I really thought I knew everything about everything. So I worked for a woman who was very practical when it came to office supplies. Now, I will say as a business owner, I really wish my employees treated office supplies with this much reverence. But I'd gone into her office, said to her, I need a new pen. She looked up. Now that I'm almost 60 years old, I appreciate this look more than ever. When you're reading and your eyes come up. And she said, you don't need a pen, you run out of ink. Well, I left that office and I was mad. But sure enough, it took me about 10 days before I really ran out of ink. The day I ran out of ink, she wasn't in her office. So I called to the attention of everybody in my cubicle. And I said, today is the day I'm getting a new pen. La da da, no one can deny me. I didn't realize this because I'm going back almost 30 years. I invented rap that day. That was my first rap. Now, what do you think? Now, I got everybody laughing, and all of a sudden they stopped simultaneously. They all stopped laughing. What do you think had happened?
She walked in.
She's standing behind me. I will tell you, I didn't understand audiences back then, so I just danced a little harder. Until I heard the voice, Miss Kidwell, may I see you in my office? The only time in my career I was ever reprimanded, I was reprimanded for disrupting the office. But I remember thinking that day, if I could only take back those words, I might have gotten a raise that year. So today we're going to explore public speaking. And I understand some of you have Christmas parties to go to or holiday parties to go to. Is that correct? Give me a head nod. You might actually learn something today that you can use at these parties. So we're going to focus on public speaking. But I promise you this. You will learn things today that will filter down into one-on-one conversations. Because my goal today is to help you improve your communication skills. Is that agreed upon? All right, if I can get some help, I have some handouts. If you could give me just 4 people to come down and actually get out of your chairs, and just 4 people to come down and help me. It's your only real chance to get up and move around. Thank you. If you could just help me with that. And then what's left over, you can put them back as people come in. Thank you, sir. And if you have tested, you can help me out. Thank you very much. Beautiful. All right.
they'll stay at the back.
So as you're getting your handout for today, as you think of questions, because what I plan to do, and I really think the most valuable thing is to really get to the question and answers to find out what I can do to help you with your present or your problems in communications. Write down your questions. If you get a question, just write it down on the back of your handout. So when we do break for questions, then you'll already know what your questions are. So does everybody have a handout? Give me a hand in the air if you don't have a handout. Ah, see? They just put those extras in the back so as people come in, they can just grab one. Perfect. And thank the people that got up to do that for me. Thank you very much. Happy holidays, and I hope you have fun at your parties. All right, let's go to page number 1 and principle number 1. And by the way, at some point, you're going to need to see this circle. So if you're not sitting in a place where you have a view of this circle, at some point you're going to need to see that. So let's go to principle number 1, which is to connect with your audience. So here's some facts about your audience. This is why I want you to start with this one principle. 60% of the time, people do not pay attention to the speaker at all. It's going to happen. You're going to think of something you needed to do that you left before you left your office, something with the children, are they getting home on time, something with the spouse, something with your boss, something with the speaker. Something is going to pop in your mind, and you will get distracted. Now, I'm going to tell you, as long as I've been doing presentations, this has been true. But I'll tell you what is significantly different with today's audiences than what audiences would do even 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, an audience member would drift out. They would just sort of drift away. What do they do today? They get their phones out. It's like an advertisement to the speaker. I have just checked out, and I'm not listening to you anymore. You're going to do it to me. I'm going to watch some point. You're going to check your text. You're going to see if you had a phone call. It's human nature that I can't speak as fast as you can think. So enjoy yourself. Instead of worrying about them texting or getting on the phone, think, ha-ha, I can do whatever I want because they're not paying any attention. Age matters. Age matters. I'll give you my horror story. About 15 years ago, I was asked to speak at the Hobie Convention. Has anybody heard of Hobie? It's a Hugh O'Brien youth organization. And they invite about 600 16-year-old children, all academically superior. They can't be there because they're good sports. They got to be there because they are math geniuses or whatever. But they're academically, they qualify academically. They asked me to speak 10 minutes about being a business owner. I know about that. And I'm going to tell you, you were 30 years old, I'd have rocked your world. At 16, it was the longest 10 minutes of your life to date. You want to hear what was even worse? The speaker after me, when they got up, he knew about their certain music that they listened to and icons that they had. And he made references about school. And they all connected with him as I stood on the side and realized that age matters. So think about your presentation in terms of your audience. Now this is the thing you can write me up and say to Hopkins, I wasn't delicate, didn't handle this correctly, but huddle in. Gender matters too. So age matters, gender matters, what the education of your audience matters. Think about this in terms of your audience. So that's principle number 1, connect with your audience. Let's move to principle number 2. And to know your walk-away message. This is almost going to sound backwards. I'd like you to start with the end in mind. What is your audience to do when they walk away from your presentation? I'm shocked how many times I'm working with an individual speaker and I'll ask them that question. And I'll give you subtle differences. I work at Hopkins with some of the research groups that are going for money for grants. So they've gone through a lot of the trials and tribulations that some of you might know about. They're getting to a point where now they're going to make a decision. They're going to have to go in front of a panel or in front of an audience and get money. Now, when I sit with them, I'll say, what's your walk-away message? And 9 out of 10 times, you know what they'll tell me? For people to understand my research. Do you know what their walk-away message is? Get the funding. Do you see the difference? So you've got to understand what is the audience to do when they walk away. And once you get that, it's going to help you direct all the preparations we're going to talk about will help you focus back on what is it the audience is to learn from you in the time you've been allowed. So far, so good. Give me a head nod. All right, let's go to principle number 3. You can't hear me in the back? How am I doing as far as voice? You can't hear me in the back? Give me a head nod. You're good? You want me to be higher? Wow. I don't think I've ever been told to speak louder in my life. This is something, excuse me, but I need to write home. I need to call my mother. All right. So, walk-away message. What is the audience to do when they walk away? Give me a head nod so far. We're so good. So we know to connect with our audience, start with the end in mind. Let's go to principle number 3. Organize, prepare, and practice. I've got a question. How many of you have a lot of extra time on your hands? So if I said to you, in order for you to really prepare and practice for a presentation, you should do that presentation 7 times before you deliver it live in front of an audience. Do you have the time for that kind of practice? No. So I want to give you a way that you can put together your presentation very quickly, and then we'll work on the 2 parts that I want you to focus on when it comes to scripting out your presentation. So let's look at the first part, organization. Everybody can see this, right? Give me, if you can, you might have to move because I see there's a lot of, can you see it over there? Have it over here? Good, all right. So now I know what my walk-away message is. I call this snowflaking. I'm going to also tell you that this method, you can use it not only to get ready for presentations, which is what I'm going to show you how to do, but I use it to get ready for meetings that I have to attend. If I have a meeting with an employee about a certain skill that they need to improve upon, I can use that as my walkaway message and use this method to mentally prepare myself for that meeting. So my walkaway message. Now for me, today, it's to teach you some tips and techniques to improve your communication skills. So, I'll give myself 30 minutes. I'm sorry, 30 seconds. 30 seconds just to do what I call brain dump. So if you could, find a blank piece of paper, take your handouts, and either turn them over on the back or get out a piece of paper. I want you all to get out a piece of paper for me, and you'll need a pen. So you'll need a pen and a piece of paper. Does everybody have that? Oh, you thought you were just going to come and sit. Piece of paper and a pen. And for the sake of this exercise, I want you to put a circle in the middle of that piece of paper and put your area of expertise. Put what you would be asked to speak about, or your parents. You might be very active in some sports. You might be whatever it is, including what we do at Hopkins, please just put in that circle an area of your expertise. Maybe a hobby or anything like that. And I'm going to give you a countdown of 30 seconds for you to start expanding on that area of expertise and start breaking it down into smaller and smaller chunks. Because what I want you to learn here is how to take this much expertise, which if you haven't got the expertise, you haven't earned the right to speak on the matter. Do you agree with that? Give me a head nod. So if you're not the expert, but the problem with being the expert is they've told you what? You've got 30 minutes to explain this, or you've got 10 minutes. So I'm going to teach you how to take that volume of information, and then we're going to start taking it down into smaller chunks. So everybody has their area of expertise? All right, I'm going to give you a countdown of 30 seconds. I'll be walking around the room to help you to see how far you can go with your snowflake. Any questions? Ready, set, go. That should be 30 seconds. All right, put down your pencils. Now, once I spend 30 seconds to a minute to start that, what I call as a brain dump, the next thing I'll do is start eliminating things that I don't have time to present or might not be appropriate, going back to principle number 1, might not be appropriate for the audience. So I spend just a minute to start this, and then I'll start expanding on the parts that I'm going to keep and start numbering them based on the order I want to present them. So in about 5 minutes, I can get a pretty general outline of what a 45-minute presentation will look like. Try it. Try it the next time you're called into a meeting. Think about just 30 seconds, how quick you can put together something and start your brain formulating some ideas as you go forward. Any questions so far about that? All right, let's move on. So, let's think about where we're at. We've analyzed our audience. We've decided what our walkaway message is. We've done some brainstorming about our walkaway message. And for beginning and ending, this is the part of your presentation that I would spend particular time with, and almost, if for me, I'll script it out. I'll run the body of my presentation with the bubbles that we just put together on that snowflake. But my introduction and my conclusion, I will spend time to make sure they're exactly the way I want them to be. Do you know people make a decision within 8 seconds whether they like you or not? It used to be 30 seconds, but now it's even faster. It's now down to 8 seconds. So you want to spend some time on the introduction because you don't have a lot of time to make that impact with your audience and get them involved in your walkaway message. In your conclusion, same thing. Spend some time on the conclusion and how it's going to tie back into your walkaway message. And there is something I do want to mention when we're talking about conclusions. And I see this a lot, and I have to say most of the time at universities. So if you see this, just give me a head nod. Have you ever seen a presenter that will say somewhere along the line, let me conclude by saying this, and then 30 minutes later they're still talking? Have you ever seen that happen? Have you ever seen somebody say, let me summarize, and then all of a sudden you're in a whole new subject matter, and you're thinking, what happened to my summary? Now, think about this from your audience standpoint. A lot of the time you mentally check out of the room. When your speaker says in conclusion, you know where you'll come? Mentally back in the room. You'll say, hey, this finally I'm going to figure out what she's been talking about. She's going to give me that walk-away message. And if you don't conclude, when you say you're going to conclude, you will start systematically losing your audience and I've seen this happen. I've seen conclusions, a false conclusion, real conclusion, and actually have seen people say to their audience, I've just finished my talk now. I'm finished, thank you very much. And you're like, wow, because no one figured it out. Because they were mentally not in the room. What do you think I want you to do when you say in conclusion? What do you think I want you to do when you say in conclusion? I want you to conclude. I want you to go to your conclusion. If something has come, and this is going to happen, you're going to say those magic words and something's going to pop into your mind that you knew you should have said. Let it come up in your Q&A. Work it in your Q&A as best you can. But try to go to your conclusion as soon as you say those words. Any questions so far? All right, let's talk prep. I use this formula all the time. And I've trained myself that before I open my mouth, I will actually do this subconscious exercise. What is my point? And I should be able to state my point in 10 words or less, and I've used this all afternoon in this presentation. I told you to connect with your audience. I gave you some reasons why that was important. I gave you an example about when I gave a presentation and failed with an audience, a younger audience, and then I said connect with your audience. Let's move on to principle number 2. So think about when you answer a question, if you can start formulating it into a concise answer. Now, what's great about this formula is you don't necessarily have to use the whole formula. Certain points will stand on their own. Certain points will need the backup of why they're important and examples of how to illustrate that. Using a doctor example, my mother recently, and I'm not a doctor, so for the doctors in the room, I know as I talk about this is not going to be probably technically correct. But my mother had polyps on her nose a couple years ago, and they were taken off, no cancer, and they came back. Well, my mother's a little bit of a drama queen. Does anybody have a mom that's a little bit of a drama queen? You can say yes. We all been there. She calls the family together, it's got to be cancer. This is it. Now, when we get to the doctor, this is what the doctor said to her. Mrs. Kidwell, do you garden? And I'm thinking, where are we going with this? He said, do you garden? She said, yeah, I do. I have a little tomato garden. He said, at the beginning of the year, do you weed that garden? Mom said, yes. And periodically during the year, do you also weed it? Mom said, yeah. He said, that's all this is. Periodically, we'll weed the garden. You're not dying of cancer. They just did the same thing they did before, but my reason I want you to think about that is sometimes the example can be something that will illustrate it, but you can tie it back to your point. So think point, reason, example, point. All right, let's move on. We could spend all day on this one. How many people are currently using PowerPoint or some type of visual aid when they're doing a presentation? Hand back, please. So most in the room. Yeah. For those that have their hands up, is most of this PowerPoint? Give me a head nod. So most. All right. So let's talk PowerPoint. First off, you've noticed I'm not using it, right? I had my come to PowerPoint moment. Years ago, I was speaking in front of a very large audience, about 2,500 people. I had my first principle up, connect with your audience. I'm on stage, I'm looking at this big slide, and I said, forget it, I'm not using it. Because I'll tell you what happens. People will pay attention to your slide, am I correct? It's something that I think is amazing. If I put a white light up here, no matter what's going on, you'll all really stare at that white light. So think about when you're putting together visual aids that these should be aids for your audience. The minute they become a script for you, you're going to violate or not be aware of principle number 1, which is about connecting with your audience. Have you ever seen anybody read their PowerPoint slides? Do you love it? Not at all. So think about when you're putting together visual aids, it should be an aid for your audience to learn, not for you to not forget that you were going to say a certain thing at a certain time. So let's think about comparison. Forget what's going on in the Sudan right now, because I need to take you back about maybe 10, 15 years. I had a group of students that were going to the Sudan to talk to the Sudan government about their water supply. There was a certain disease, again, not the doctor in the room, that was caused because of the water supply wasn't filtered. It was had mold and bugs and all kind of horrible things in their water. So their mission was to go to the government to say, okay, we would like to put in filtration systems to clean the water supply. With me so far? Now, think about these two. We first started with a slide that listed all the contaminants in the water. We replaced it with a slide. Now I want you to think about this. A young Sudan boy, maybe about 11 or 12 years old, squatting next to a pond with a reed, and the pond is filled with just mold and mud and just horrible. What do you think has a greater impact on the audience? It'll be the picture. I can tell you what the students said to me. What if we forget one of the contaminants? That's not going to be the visual aid for your audience. Then what does it become? A script for the speaker. So think about your audience and less about what's unique. Now this is also going to sound shocking when you start talking about visual aids. Be prepared for them not to work. Do I have Mac users? Mac users, I'm going to tell you, dropping videos into your PowerPoint slides, if you get with a PC platform, sometimes those videos won't run if you run into that kind of problem. So think about, if you're using visual aids, that what if this doesn't work? How am I going to continue with my presentation? All right, let's talk color backgrounds. Think about your audience when you put together your backgrounds. If you want your lights up, make your background lighter. If you know you're going to be on the stage and you know that you're going to be in a darker environment, then the darker background works. So just find out about your lighting and about the setup of your students to decide what type of background to use. Make your fonts as simple as possible. There are fonts they're called serifs. They're little squiggly cues. They don't project well. Look for a font like Tacoma, Arial. There's some other fonts that you're going to find that are going to be very clean lined. So you're looking for a very clean line, very simple for your audience. Don't change a lot of your fonts. Have you ever seen a presentation where they have 15 different font types on one slide? Minimize that. Think about just making it simple for your audience. Think about increasing your message to the audience via your slide. All right, so we've talked about one last thing. When you're using slides, think about this. Now, you're going to live within your protocols. So if you're not allowed to do this because the way this seminar or the way the workshop is set up, you live within your protocols. But if you can, and you're using a slide that has the title of your presentation, does anybody use that? So give me your hands up. So you use, it would say 12 principles for powerful presentation for me. So you have a title slide. Think about your next slide being blank or being used if you can get a remote that will blank it out. So when you start your introduction, you're not going to start with that slide behind you. You want to know why? Because guess where people will look when that slide's up there? They're going to look at the slide. Where do I want them to look? I want them to look at you. So think about your title slide, your next slide being blank, do an introduction, and then go to your first slide being this next slide that starts your presentation. Now, I I know so many times that you're invited to presentations, they tell you this is where you're going to do it. You're not going to say, that's not what I learned at my presentation seminar. You're going to say, okay, and you'll live within your protocols, okay? But if you got a choice, try that and see how it changes the introduction to your audience. All right. I think I've covered visual aids. Now, you can see I'm pretty old school. This, I think, for the people in the back, this is hard to see. Give me a head nod if it is. So all of you can see that in the back? This isn't my preference, black. I prefer like the white background and the brighter colors, but that could be me. Just try to find something that your audience can see. And if you remember, I started with the circle, and what did I tell you all? You need to be able to see the circle at some point. So just do those, you can do those verifications with your audience if you're using something other than PowerPoint. All right, let's move on. Let's talk word choice. Does anybody hear you know, and repeat words. I volunteer at a prison on Saturdays, and we are trying to eliminate like "ya means" because they go like "ya mean" a lot. They're fillers. And what's more effective for your audience is a pause. And most people will ruin a good pause by making some type of grunt, and it's a grunt. So I want you to think about it that way. Now, you look fairly young to me, but does anybody here have any children at home? That would, oh, quite a few. That would be old enough, maybe 8 or older. You got just a few, okay. Because they're primed to, if you find yourself being in the category, you realize that you say it a lot. The best way to get rid of that is to become aware of it. That's one thing I love about Toastmasters. I don't know about your Toastmaster club, but my Toastmaster club counts the ums. And then to make insult to injury, they charge you a nickel per at the end of the meeting. It can get expensive, but it's all about becoming aware of it, because once you become aware of it, guess what will happen? You'll pause the next time instead of saying or some type of filler. So think in the right word choice. Think about not using any word choice at all and just a pause. All right. Let's talk but. B-U-T. People forget what you say after you say but. This is the best looking audience I've ever had, but aren't you waiting? Find out how I really feel. You know, you say to your husband, you know, how do I look? You look great, but aren't you waiting? Aren't you waiting? So think about leaving the audience, or who you're having a conversation with what you want them to remember after the but. So if somebody said to you today, why don't we have dinner tonight? You could say, I can't have dinner tonight, but I'd love to do that another time. Do you know what they'll be left with? I'd love to do that another time. You can reverse that. I'd love to do that another time, but I can't have dinner with you tonight. You know what they'll remember? That you can't have dinner with them tonight. So think about how you can use that word to your advantage. If you're in negotiations and you can't remember that, A and D is a replacement. A and D doesn't have that shoe drop that the BUT does. So think about how to use that word properly. Other words I'm going to caution you on are always and never. You work at Hopkins. Dare you say that never happens. Because you're going to have somebody who wrote the book on it and is going to be able to prove you wrong. So be very careful how you use absolutes. You better be able to prove it. It always happens this way. You better be able to back it up with some data. That never will happen. You better be able to back it up with data. So carefully use absolutes. All right, let's move on. Do you have room that you can stand up at your seats? Do you have room that you can stand up? If you do, stand up for me, please. I want you to put your hands out in front of you, just like this, Frankenstein style. And I want you to pretend that I've come around and I've given each of you a monarch butterfly. And in your dominant hand, whether that's left or right, I want you to take that butterfly and pinch the wing ever so slight that you don't tear the wing, but you don't let it fly away. So you've got to pinch it just so right. And when I say 3, put your hands on your chin. 3. I said chin. How many are on your cheeks? Well, you're at Hopkins. Chin, sit down. People will believe your body language before they'll believe what you say. So your body language needs to be congruent with your statement. So I even gave you a pause and said 3, and when I said chin, when I put my hand on my cheek, most of you stood looking at me with your hand on the cheek even after I said chin again. Why? Because you'll believe the body language. So you've got to be congruent with your body language. If I said to you, look, doing a presentation can be a lot of fun. Really. It's the best thing. Are you going to believe it? So you'll believe the body language if it doesn't match what your message is. So your message needs to match your body language. So some things I want to remind you with your body language. Try to remember open palms. This and this can accomplish the same thing. If you have a question, you have a question. See the difference? So think open palms. You can accomplish the same thing without pointing. So think open palms. Think about using your stage. You probably figured this out. My challenge is not movement. I need to minimize my movement. Some people need to maximize their movement because movement brings some energy from the audience. So think about your stage moving to certain times where you'll talk to this side of the audience, and then times you'll talk to the back side of the audience, and then to your center. So think about using your stage. But, see, this is the part I want you to remember. I don't want you pacing. You know what pacing is? Have you seen that? Have you seen people that sway? How about front swayers? It's all how you release your nervous energy. So an easy way to remember, if you find yourself moving and it's just to release nervous energy, try V feet. V feet is a way that you can put your feet, so you need to be about 6 inches apart, slightly outward, and get used to this position because it's a position that when you're in, it's hard to sway, it's hard to do, all those nervous habits can be removed by just remember to V feet. All right, so we talked body language. Now let's talk vocal variety. Does anybody here remember the Y2K scare? That was, I think it was December 31st, 1999. Didn't we have planes were going to drop from the sea, the skies, the electricity wasn't going to work. It was the Y2K scare. I took my husband to see a congressperson tell business people what's going to happen to this Y2K. By the way, I even filled my bathtub full of water that night. I was so sure. Nothing happened, by the way, right? So this is before Y2K. I take him to see a guy who's going to tell us what to do. And he had about 2 inches of paper in front of him. And he just kept flipping and reading from that paper. He never raised his voice. He never slowed his voice down. He never picked up its speed. He never got louder. He never got softer. He read at the same speed. Now, I married an engineer. My husband started calculating how long it was taking him to read 1 page. Then did the calculations of how many pages would be left to try to estimate how long, because I had insisted on sitting in the front. Use your voice. Zig Ziglar said that the best sales tool you have is your voice. Use it. Use it sometimes to get louder, sometimes to be softer, sometimes to be slower, and sometimes to speed it up. Sameness is your enemy when it comes to your voice. So use your vocal variety. Now, I've got 2 exercises for you to do. And this is something I'm going to tell you do not do at Hopkins. Okay? So this is definitely, don't do this while you're sitting at work. And if you do, I will deny teaching it to you. But these are 2 exercises that opera singers use to keep their vocal cords, have the elastic, again, I'm not the doctor, elasticity in their vocal cords. So it makes their voice have a lot more pitch and a lot more variety with it. But there are 2 things that are going to look ridiculous. So I'm going to do it first, and then you're going to do it with me. And then you're never going to do this at work. It looks like this. It's called bubbling. You ready? No, some of you were pretty good at this. When I first, I went to a vocal coach because I would come home after lecturing for a few hours. And I don't know if this happens to anybody here, but my voice would almost be getting an upward pitch to it. Has that ever happened to anybody? You kind of are going into this range right here. And I'd come home and my husband Frank would say, "How was your day?" And I'd say, "Oh, I don't want to talk about it." So I went to a vocal coach and she said, "Look, Karen, you cannot expect your voice after resting it for 3 or 4 days and then taking it out." She compared it to like running a marathon and never preparing to run the marathon, just getting up that day and running the 26+ miles. So I do that every day. I do it about a minute a day. And again, I use the word promise very carefully. If you do this every day, after about 6 weeks, you're going to notice a strength in your voice that you didn't have before. An ability to maybe hit a lower register or even a higher register than you were before. But it's not a magic pill. You can't do this once and then all of a sudden you're James Earl Jones. It's not going to happen. But you do this every day. After about 6 weeks, you're going to see a change in your voice. Now, the other thing is about exercising the jaw. Because this is the part of the body you're using when you're doing a presentation. But it's probably not something you think about. You probably exercise all your other muscles, but let's talk about the jaw. So this is a way, you're going to take your tongue along your teeth. You're going to do it 3 ways, 3 one way, and then 3 the other. It looks like this. Do it with me. Not do it at Hopkins. Just this one, something you do in the car on your way home. Looks like this. Now you know why I questioned the YouTube video. 3 ways. We'll do the other one. How many people are starting to feel fatigue in their face? Some? Yeah. You want to do that every day because it's about building up the muscles you use when you do a presentation. So think about doing those 2 things, the bubbling and that tongue sweep, and do that every day and get to a point where you'll find that elasticity in your voice. All right, so we talked about body language, we've talked about voice. Let's talk just for a moment about eye contact. Eye contact needs to have variety, so you need to get around your room. You all have presented me with a big challenge today because you're all scattered around the room. So I've tried to make sure that at some point I'm looking back here and at some point I'm down front here. But if I stare too long at one person, doesn't this get to be really uncomfortable for just everybody around? Everybody's like, why? Just her. Right? And I don't want you to become shifty-eyed. Shifty-eyed looks like this. So just think about enough eye contact that you could fill a glass of water, and then you'll move on to the next person and fill their glass of water. It's about that much time you want to get. Now, sometimes in a larger audience, you don't have the luxury that I do here. I can see your faces. So for some, when you're presenting at a seminar, you might find that you're faced with lights. Have you ever seen that? And you can't see your audience at all. You know what I want you to do with your eye contact? Fake it. Just pretend that you can see, because people still want to see your eyes. All right, let's move on. Two sides to the next principle, which is keep your sense of humor. People do learn by laughing, so if you can infuse any type of humor into your presentation, that's a good thing. But I'll tell you why it's here as a principle. Things are going to go wrong for you. Your handouts aren't going to arrive. Your slides aren't going to be working. The microphone's not going to work. Something's going to go wrong. And if you can't learn to laugh about it, you're going to ruin it for your audience. So think about keeping a sense of humor. Now, last but not least on this topic, have you ever heard of a triple? People think in threes. If you have, this is homework for you. Watch the Comedy Channel. Watch a couple stand-up comedians, and you'll get into a rhythm of threes. So you'll find that the first two will set you up one way, and the third will be the U-turn and the funny. So I'll give you a quick example, and I'll show you and impress you with the kind of television I watch. Anybody here ever watched The King of Queens? See, it's a sitcom about a delivery guy who happens to be very overweight and a very beautiful wife. And this is his sequence. This is a triple. The house is on fire. He says to his wife, "Don't forget the microwave." Remember, he's overweight. "Don't forget my fry baby." This is the triple. "And don't forget my ab roller." That's a triple. So think in threes, two taking you in one direction, and the third being the funny. All right, let's move on. Number 10, managing and adapting your environment. Do your best with what you're given. So the first advice I have for you is don't worry if it's not exactly the way you wanted it set up. Just adapt to it. In this type of audience, I've noticed you all sat in the back. Is that because you heard that I got violent or something like that? Is there a reason you're all sitting in the back? I go crazy? Is that what you heard? By the way, that's typical in an audience. And it doesn't bother me because I move around a lot, so it probably would intimidate somebody being too close. But if it does bother you, you can ask your audience to move forward or just put something to block a couple rows to force your audience forward. I've seen this not work for presenters. So I've just seen when presenters have said, "Okay, everybody move to the front." Have you ever seen that? And nobody moves? They move to the front, and everybody just looks at, "Move to the front," and then, like, what have you accomplished? So think about either, setting up ahead of time or living with the fact that people do like to sit in the back. And for those sitting in the back, that's why I'm messing with my microphone. People in the front are getting it all good. The people in the back are getting loud, soft, loud, soft, loud, soft. Let's move on. We could spend a lot of time talking about questions. This is my least favorite way to do questions, is to save them and do them all at the end. I prefer to have questions as we go, but the larger the group, the harder that gets to manage. So it's sort of like up to you as the speaker to determine whether you want to take questions as you go or at the end. And for me, it's an audience size thing. If I have 15 or less, I'll take questions as I go. If the audience gets to be about this size, it becomes too hard to manage, and then you get tied up on certain questions, and you can't move through material. So for me, and it depends on the audience size, how I do questions. But there is something, do you remember what I told you about questions when I began? So if you have a question, what did I tell you to do?
Write it down.
Write it down. Do you want to know why I told you to do that? Because audiences will get hung up on a question. And if they don't write it down or don't get it off their mind, it'll prevent them from hearing what you're talking about over the next couple minutes. Has that ever happened to you where the speaker will say something, you'll think, "Oh, well, what about X?" And then all of a sudden you realize the speaker has moved forward. So by telling you to do that, that was my cue for you to say, look, if you have a question, write it down, get it off your mind so you can come back and listen to the lecture. It is up to you how you deal with Q&A, but I can tell you I've seen presenters that have had amazing presentations, and I mean amazing presentations, turn it over to Q&A, question and answers, and I've watched them totally fail. Have you ever seen that happen? So I'm going to tell you some ways that you can get ready for question and answers. One, go back to your snowflake. The material that you don't have time to present might come up in your Q&A. So by doing that right before you get up before your presentation, it'll give you some ways that you can actually start preparing for questions that might come up. What's your biggest fear when it comes to question and answers? Is it the one you can't answer? Is that your fear? You're going to ask me a question and I'm not going to know the answer and I'm going to say, I don't know. You're not going to like this. Because when I show you this, it's going to expose all the politicians. Because I'm going to show you how a politician is asked a question and will not answer that question, but get you off to another topic. Okay? It's called the ABC. I can't answer your question because, but what I can tell you is, Mr. Politician, are you going to raise my taxes? I can't answer that question because I don't have all the figures with me, but I can tell you I'm going to try not to. Or I can tell you I'm really pro getting that dam fixed and the bridge over it. So watch this. You will get up on a Sunday morning, watch Meet the Press and all Face the Nation, and watch the way they use that formula to not answer a question. So it is something you can use if you can't answer a question. It is a way that you can get around by. The other alternative is to say, I don't know. And I'm going to tell you at Hopkins, if you don't know, don't fake it. If you don't know the answer, say you don't know the answer. Now, do you ever have somebody in your audience that knows more about your subject matter than you do? It kind of happens at Hopkins all the time, right? So have you ever had a question that's asked to you, but really is for the expert that's sitting in your audience? Have you ever seen that happen? I'm going to give you a way you can still maintain control of the audience, because this is what normally happens. You have a question for an expert in CPR that's sitting here. You ask the question, and it goes directly to the expert, and the expert stands up and answers the question. Where does the next question go to? Expert every time. Watch. Become a student of audiences. Start watching these things. When you're sitting and you're in a group and you're watching a presentation, start looking around and saying, hey, this is what's going on. Okay, so the next question comes to the expert. What have you done as the presenter then? You've lost control. Now, a way you can handle this. The question comes. You go to your expert. Mr. Expert, the question is, and you get the expert to answer you back. Then you repeat the question to the audience. Guess where the next question will come? It'll come back to you. So think about ways that you can still use that expert and still get the question answered without having to omit over and over again, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. All right, last thing I'm going to say about questions and answers. Have you ever heard the expression, there are no stupid questions? There are really stupid questions. There are stupid questions. You're just going to have to answer them. And you know, on the other side, there are really good questions. Try not to grade the good questions. Because I'll tell you what happens. I'm very competitive by nature. So if I'm in an audience and you say, wow, that was a good question, you know what Karen Storey starts thinking about? A better question. Because if you think that's a good question, wait till you hear my question, Mr. Speaker. It's going to blow your mind. Now, you also have people in the audience when you say good question that might have a question and they might think this, that really was a good question. Not as good as my question. I'm not going to ask my question. Whose question do you want? The overachiever who's trying to be better than the next person, or the simple question that you can answer? It's the simple question you can answer. So don't grade your questions, just answer the questions. And we're going to do questions when we get done, and I'm really anxious to hear what your questions are. So now that I've given you all my techniques, when I say I can't answer that question because, but what I can tell you, you'll know what I'm doing. If I say I can't answer the question, or if someone else can, you'll see how those strategies work. All right, let's move on to our last principle. Well, I have controlled you all day, much to my delight. I've done it a couple ways. When you give out handouts, you have an exposure, just like when you give copies of your slides out. What's the exposure when I give you my handout? And I'm just doing principle number 1. What's the exposure I have as a speaker? You're going to what? Look ahead. You're going to look ahead. So there's a couple things I've done to get you back on track. I've been very quiet at times, referred to the numbers. A couple times I came here and did this. I don't even know what I was doing. I just take a page and just make a noise with it. And you know what you would do every time? You're so cute. You'd figure out what page I was on and you go back to it. So if you're going to use handouts, figure out a way or know a way that you can control the use of how the audience is going to use your handouts. Now, I'll give you my horror story when it comes to handouts. When I started doing this presentation, it's been 20 plus years, I used to give a simple piece of paper that had the principles written down and sort of had this attitude, if you want to take notes, take notes. Well, guess where most of my handouts ended up? Anybody want to guess? On the chairs, in the trash. So one day, I'm done my presentation, and a gentleman is standing in the back of the room, and I'm not shy. I'm assuming it's to say great presentation or, one of those things. So he's waiting in the back, and I'm finishing up, getting my room back to normal. He's standing in the back, and it's time. I go up and shake his hand and say, thank you for coming to my presentation. And he says, hey, I really did enjoy your presentation. I thought you gave a lot of tips, techniques, and all that, but you know what? Your handouts stink. You know what? When somebody gives you really critical feedback, there's two things you can do. Listen or not listen, right? Right? So I thought, well, I'll give this guy a shot, So I said, well, what would you think would be a good idea? And he said, I think checklists would really be helpful if you had checklists that people could take away and actually go back to your handout and review the things that you discussed in class. So I said, okay. So we started working on that project, and oh, by the way, that's how I met my husband. Now, I want you to know, he's paying for that every day of his life. I just want you to know. But I can tell you what has happened because I don't use slides, and I do something that now is considered maybe old school, but it's different than what other people are doing. People are less likely to chuck my handouts. And I find that just like how I think we all got in touch with each other, it's often through somebody who has my handouts. So think about, for your audience, support of that walk-away message. What can you provide them that they can walk away with? So it's just another, I know that in this electronic world, we're going in a totally different direction versus physical handouts, but there is something to the touch of having that piece of paper in your hand. So it's not negated yet as a strategy of learning. So think about what you can do to add value in your handouts. Now, that's my 12 principles, and as I promised you, I wanted to get your questions so we can really focus on what you're really here about. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. All the way in the back.
So I think you have to think of very clearly. So you have that is like triple strategy.
This triple?
Yes.
You want another example?
Yeah.
All right, I'll give you a Hopkins example. One of your deans was asked to give a keynote at a medical student's graduation. All right, so that's the setup. Her point was, remember to laugh. Don't let life get so serious that you forget that laughter. This was her triple, so this is a triple. She said an average baby will laugh 400 times per day. The average adult will laugh 15 times per day. Now, you ready for the triple? The Hopkins faculty, 0 times per day. So that's a triple. So she's setting it up one way. And by the way, when she said the Hopkins faculty, what do you think most of the medical students were already saying? None. None. So it's just you think you're going in one direction, but it's going to be, the third is going to be the funny.
Is it a joke or is it for your personal?
It's really for, you can use it with humor, but you can also use it, you'll see triples are used a lot in setting up like I use it for tips, techniques, and tools. That's a triple. So it's just a rhythm that people will think in. So you can use it for humor, but you can also use it to accentuate or accent a point.
This is less than, I guess, a formal presentations, but general communication, like you mentioned. So what I hear a lot of Hopkins interacting with everybody is everyone's busy, everyone's hectic, and that's what they're doing, so things are so crazy. And I came about an article that was interesting, and they said you should not do that when communicating with people, that it kind of automatically alienates you and implying that your schedule is more important than theirs and doesn't give you a way to connect. I was wondering what your opinion on that.
I'm 100% with what you read, because personally that's, if I said, let's do this, and you said, oh, I'm so busy, 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 you know what my response is? Like, who isn't? So to me, it's just, how would my mother say this? Whining, and it's not necessary. So what I would think is try to remember how you would want somebody to communicate with you, and would you want somebody saying, oh, I'm just too busy to do that? There's a better way of saying no.
I can probably speak loud enough. So one, is it working?
No.
Switch it on. Okay. So one thing that I've seen more and more often happening at the beginning of the presentation is people saying, my presentation is organized in this way, and I'm going to be talking about this and that and that. I personally hate it. I don't know why people are doing this. Your presentation is not a book. I cannot choose when I'm going to sleep and when I'm going to follow you. If I'm going to sleep, I'm probably going to miss the part that I'm interested in anyway, even if you told me when it is. So why are people doing it? Is this really helpful in any way?
I think because, just to go back to your principles, principle number 4 was to prepare your introduction. And to me, somebody that just does that little outline is because they're a little nervous, and that's one way that they can get into their presentation. So some of that's more for the speaker than it is for the audience. So but I've actually seen that work really well. So I think that some speakers can pull that off. But that's what I think. I think it's a lot of times they just didn't prepare a good introduction, and that's the introduction they're going to use. Let me just give you a quick example. I worked with a doctor who was presenting information about a new, and again, I'm not the doctor, it had to do with a new test for your heart. And it was a non-invasive test. And he's talking to doctors. So we're thinking about how to open, and he has started with that. I'm going to show you the way that we're doing it now, the new test, and then the difference. And we ended up with this opening, and this is, think about this. The opening was, pay attention to this presentation, you're most likely going to die from this disease. I want you to know, there wasn't a doctor in there that didn't say, okay, I better pay attention. So I think some people don't put enough emphasis on how they're going to open that presentation, so they go with a standard outline. I think put a little effort into it. That would be my suggestion. I like the way this microphone is going around. It's almost like an Oprah kind of thing.
Kind of a similar
question. People generally just do the conclusion slide. They'll be like, these are my main points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I was just wondering if it's kind of a similar thing, like if that is preferred, or is it more, you should put more emphasis on your conclusion, just speaking, maybe not having just your key points at the end?
I think you can get away with the key points, but I'll tell you what I would suggest. If you have the 5 key points, don't read them like this. So if I have my conclusion, and I'm getting to my conclusion, I say, these are the 5 things I want you to remember, and I'm not looking at my slide, I've moved a little closer to my audience, that can work, because that can back up what you're saying and reinforce your walkway message. But if you're going to put that up there and do this, have you ever seen that? 1, this is my 1 conclusion, this is my number 2 conclusion, check in, number 3 conclusion. Have you seen that happen? Well, that, to me, they're not really concluding. So even though that the words might back up, I like the person to be front and center, delivering that conclusion, and really doing it without looking at their notes. Because you think about it, people will remember what you begin with and how you end. And you know, I'm sorry to say that's the attention span of most audiences. So ending is really important, and building to that conclusion. But just to read it like this, don't waste my time. Just print it out and send it to me. I'd rather do it that way. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Question. Just to clarify, regarding ABC strategy, so my understanding is that you recommend that it's not the best strategy in academic setting.
I didn't hear that last part. I'm
So
sorry.
ABC strategy that you
Yes.
introduced. So my understanding is that it's not the best strategy in academic setting. You don't recommend it for academic setting.
On the what setting? I'm missing.
Academic.
In academic setting?
Academics. Oh, I think it works. I just don't want you to be so obvious with it, but I'll give you where I've seen it work. Using myself. Somebody asked me, their question had to do with red blotches on their neck. So she would not manifest any kind of nervousness, except she would have red blotches that would come on her neck. So her question to me was, what can I do about the red blotches? I can't answer that because I'm not a doctor and I don't understand why. But what I can tell you, and I gave her some suggestions on ways that she can deal with that. So I think you can use it. It's just, I don't want you to use it so much it becomes obvious. Does that make sense? So use it sparingly, but you can use that strategy just because it's a refocus on the question of getting it back to your answer. So yeah, it'll work in an academic setting. Just don't do it over and over and over. Finally, a question from this side of the room. I was really worried about you all.
We're just sleeping on this side.
You're either sleeping or you really just took it all in and didn't have any questions.
So a lot of what we do, well at least what I do, is presentation of data, specifically
Okay?
lots of it. Right?
Okay.
So 2 questions that I have. Number 1, the vast majority of what a lot of us do until we get to be professors is posters. So you get
Okay.
5 minutes, maybe 8 minutes. And what I run into a lot of the times is all of the information I'm going to speak about is on the poster, and it's all right there all the time. So maybe some tips, thoughts that you might have on how to keep people from doing this, or looking at the next poster, or looking over your entire poster, or asking about this point before I get there. So sometimes that depends on the audience, but that first question. Second question, lab meetings, all we're doing in there is presenting data. Most of the times you've got a PI that'll put you either Friday at 4 p.m. or Tuesday at 7 a.m. So it's usually dark, and all we're presenting is data. So how do we keep it focused? I get it, and I believe you that they're only going to remember the beginning and the end, but the stuff in the middle is the only reason we're actually there. So how to keep putting that forward, and how to make sure that that doesn't happen.
All right. So second question first. How do you keep that from not happening? I think you could do, and this is just my idea, with your vocals. I see a lot of people when they present data, they get into this like almost a monotone about it. You need to punch your voice. And sometimes you need to use your voice just like I did here. That is one way, because I'm a data person myself, by the way, Mike. all my original studies and background is in finance, so I could sit in a meeting and drool over numbers. My husband would want to just hang himself before listening to a bunch of numbers. So for me, that's exciting. So for the non-financial person, you got to really do it with your voice and making sure that you're getting the attention. Now back to what was the first question?
First question, you're doing a poster presentation?
Oh, the poster.
All
Oh,
the data's there all the time.
you know what? I hate to say this, but to me, they're the worst. Because,
That's why I'm asking.
I know. Because if it's my understanding, you can't deviate from that either. Like they give you the size, they tell you all the data has to be on this particular thing. So again, body language and vocal variety, I know I keep going back to the basics, but it's a way that you can control when someone's looking away. If you can raise your voice up, maybe move over. These are posters, like physical posters, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And they're all in the room together.
About 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 at a time.
And it's my understanding people kind of walk by and you're sort of like a circus vendor saying, come to my poster, come to my poster. Yeah, you're laughing, but that's really tough. And I wish I could say there's a magic way of doing this. The best thing you can do is, one, have fun with it. People will pick up on the vibe of the person that's saying, come look at my data because I'm excited about it. So make sure that your body language is congruent with that message and that your body language isn't giving you away. But I do say that I work with a lot of researchers that do that. And outside of like, look at my poster, really you just got to be getting eye contact with the people as they're walking by, get them involved, get them drawn in. And I will say that's really, I think, a really tough presentation. So I don't envy you, but I also know you can be successful if you just try. Try it with your voice, try it with your body language. See if you can get people excited.
I think to comment, so I've run in that issue as well. And I think one of the things that helped me is when there's some people that want to see 100 posters in an afternoon and some people that want to come to your posters. And what helps for me is ask them, how much time do you have? You can have your 1 minute spiel, this is my poster in 1 minute, and then 5 minutes, and that makes you kind of prepare what to say and how to organize. So that worked for me quite well.
It's a great suggestion to ask for the time. Other questions? It's serious when they give you the mic. Huh? All of a sudden, everybody's looking at you and you better do this right.
I have a question about how much do you expect an audience is following your words? You put all the data on the slides and just hope that they're following both your words, and if they are missing out, they can just look at the slide and still follow what you're saying.
Well, I'm not big on it, but sometimes, and I'm going to say use this sparingly, so don't go crazy when I say this, but sometimes you can effectively do that with pointers. The laser pointers. If you know, and I don't want you to go crazy. Have you ever seen somebody go crazy with them? I don't want you to go crazy with them. But if you're referring to a particular part of your slide that's data infused, so you've got to get people to draw their attention to it. Sometimes with a pointer, you can do that very effectively. So that's one thing I would suggest. But again, know how to use it. So now I've got to give you my Hopkins disclosure. I have no financial interest in this gizmo at all. But logistics actually has it's a pointer and it works with PowerPoint to advance. And anybody know what I'm talking about? If you've seen it, a lot of your departments have them. What's nice about it is it tags up to a USB port and it gives you a lot of freedom to be away from. So now I can walk closer to my data and still have control with my pointer and how I'm advancing my slides. So that would be one suggestion I would have. Again, I think I mentioned this when I was talking about visual aids. You got to live within your protocols. I've worked with a group that they had to present their whole research material on 3 slides, period. There was no beginning, that was it, 3 slides. They're going to be data, they're going to be really heavily dated if you do it with that. You're going to have to live within that protocol and just make sure you're drawing attention with the eye to where it needs to be. Other questions?
Okay. So just a response to your don't grade your question. So I don't have this habit of grade my question, but I see people do that and I feel like it's a kind of a courtesy to say that. So then I pick up this habit. Whoever who actually it's whoever asks a question, I'll just like saying by habit, that's a good question, and just, just like small
Well,
things.
see, that's the habit. Now, again, I know you've seen this. Have you seen the speaker that says, good question? And then the next question, you and I both know wasn't that good. Right? You've seen it, right? And what do they say? Good question, because they've sort of boxed themselves in this corner where they're going to say either they're going to grade the question truly and say that was a good question, and by the way, yours was not. Or just by not grading the question, you're not going to box yourself into that corner. And that's another thing I see a lot of speakers when they start that good question, then the next question's a good question, the next question's a good question, the next question, and then you as the audience almost start getting that, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't that good of a question. So, be careful with that because you'll box yourself into a corner, and that's a hard corner to get out of. I did watch a speaker one time use it in this way, but he used it as a funny. So this is like what he did with his triple. The first question, he said, that was a great question. In fact, it was such a good question, I'm going to give you my book. Okay? Next question, he said, oh, that was also a great question. That was such a great question, I'm going to also give you a book. The third question, now he did this for the laugh. The guy asked the question, he went, huh? That's really not that great of a question, I'm going to give you a pamphlet. Okay? So he used it to really make a funny, but you better be very confident if you're going to try to do something like that. So for me, the good question, bad question just sort of gets you into a corner that for me, Chelsea, can be very hard to get out of. So for me, it's just don't say good question or great question or bad question or lousy question, just don't grade the question. You know what I want you to do? Answer the question. Go to your answer. Other questions?
I have a questions about body language. So while talking, do you recommend to use a lot of hands or not much? Because sometimes when I talk and I use a lot of hands, people always comment that, oh, you don't look professional, you don't look like a real lady. And because real ladies use
I'll tell you what body language you should use. Use your conversational body language. And think about that when you come up to the front of the group. You don't want to use somebody else's. Years ago, I worked with this little child. I say child, he was 12. He was going for a little scholarship. And when I started working with him, his mom had taught him that anytime he said the word everyone, he went like this. Just like this. So he's talking about pollution and how everyone can solve it like this. And it was, and for me, I had to break that habit and say, look, that's what your mother told you to do. I want to see you use your own body language. So it's your conversational body language is what you want to bring to the front of the group. Now, you might be like I am. I use a lot of gestures. I use a lot of movement. I have to really teach myself, particularly when somebody's asking me a question, to keep my hands to my sides. So I'll use more body language when I'm presenting information, but when you're asked a question, try to minimize that. Try to really focus on what the person's saying and really minimize your body language. And I have a question in the front here.
I can try to be loud.
All right, I'd like that. So you try to be loud.
This is kind of relating to the question about saying that this was a good question. So whenever we are at a presentation and I'm about to ask a question, I guess I'm not that loud. So when I'm about to ask a question, I have to say something about the presentation that, oh, thank you so much, it was a good presentation, and my question is, so I hate cliches so much, and I don't know how we can avoid that, how we can just get around it and ask the question. Do you have any suggestion for it?
I don't know. I think that sounds like a great suggestion to start your questions with. I really like that presentation. I think I should be promoting that when I start doing my Q&A. I'm going to add that in. I think that's a great suggestion. But if you'd like the presentation, what I would say, if you're sincere with that, be sincere. I'm more talking about the presenter grading the questions that come from the audience. That's what I want you to be careful about. If you want to say great things to the speaker, I'm going to encourage that. But make sure you're sincere with it. That, and make sure that it's not just for the sake of a good grade and other people are like, you know, can you believe she just did that and she'll get an A? So I just get to your questions. Just, I have a question, this is my question. Other questions? Oh, this is really helpful. Oh, I thought he was going to have to run all the way to the back.
I guess, so I've noticed, you mentioned, you know, the kind of stalking back and forth, pacing, et cetera. I've also noticed in a lot of presentations, people's pitch just kind of changes, like they kind of have a little tremble, breathy voice. Do you have any recommendations for that? Because that's something I definitely observed a lot.
This is going to sound like a shameful commercial, but I would go to Toastmasters because really it's practice, practice, practice. And there is modulations that you'll learn because you do have tells. And particularly when somebody begins, that's when you'll hear most of the tremor in their voice. So you'll almost hear like a little shakiness because it's the way they're manifesting their nervousness. And again, shameless commercial for the club that invited me here, but really practice, 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 because it's a matter of doing that enough that it becomes automatic that your voice doesn't quiver like that. Like, I know this is going to sound overly simplified, but when I first started doing presentations, my tremor was in the way I would drink water. I mean, I would like almost get water all over myself trying to get it to my lips, you know. But now, watch. I took practice. So I don't mean to minimize that it happens, but it's a matter of how you can control it, and you can control it by practicing that use. And I would suggest the best bang for your buck is to practice at a Toastmaster meeting.
I guess that triggered my question. So I get very dry mouth when I'm speaking for a long time, or when I'm getting impressed by the audience as well. And I like to have the water, but I really feel awkward in stopping, pausing, and drinking. So do you have any suggestion of how to make it better?
Well, because we suffer from the same dry mouth, okay? It's the way I manifest my nervousness. Now, this is what I don't want you to do. Too much. So, I know this is going to sound really boring. You want room temperature water. You don't want it too cold, you don't want it hot. So you want it just room temperature, and you want to get used to just being able to take a very small sip, because it's not about drinking the water, it's just about moisture. So just a little sip. I try to do it at optimum times. When somebody's asking me a question, I'll drift back, try to keep my face forward, and I'll do a little sip. But again, practice. Go Toastmasters and practice this, because I'm telling you, I used to shake. And then I couldn't drink the water because then I would be shaking. I mean, my mouth would be dry. But yeah, watch. That's 20 years. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
In addition to what you said earlier about backgrounds, so if it's in a lighter room, light background, etc., are there any other rules that we should be following, like a solid color background versus the patterns or different colors of fonts that we should steer away from?
Try to look for contrast. Like if you're doing a light background, don't go a bright white. Do like an off-white, and I'll tell you, yellow is a good color for the eyes. I teach at Wilmer, and can't give you any background except yellow is a good color. So if you do like a pale yellow, and then maybe some like brown or dark lettering, that's a good color combination. I'm not big on the patterns, because the patterns, when you look at your words, they'll affect the way the words look. So for me, it's all about keeping it simple. So I would go for a light background, dark letters, but if you're going to do it the other way around, again, think of really easy contrast on the eyes. Like blue and yellow is not necessarily really easy to see when it's blown up. And that's another suggestion I have for you with your slides. Don't look at them on your screen and say, this looks awesome! Because it's going to totally look different when you blow it up and it's on a big screen. So make sure that you get out and you get it up and you see what it's going to look like when it's projected. Because like with these little serifs, these look great on a small screen. They project and they get fuzzy. So that's my suggestion would be get in the room, see what it's going to look like when it's blown up, and that's when the decisions. But don't go for anything really hard on the eyes. So anything really bright, I would steer away from. Yes?
I was just going to add something about color. I'm also in Wilmer, but my PI happens to be colorblind, and so you have to be really careful about color choices. I mean, when you're presenting data
Yes.
to this particular guide, but there's a certain percentage of people who are
And
colorblind.
thank you for reminding me, because you do have to be really conscious of, I believe it's the red-green is the most common, and who's my data presenter? Sometimes they use in contrast red and green, and you got somebody probably, I think I've heard is 20% have problems with red-green, so think of other color choices. Other questions? Well, listen, before I leave, I just want to thank you all for taking time on a very busy Christmas party day, holiday party day. I might get out of work early to come in and think about your communication skills. Because there's one thing that I know in my career, that when I started focusing on communication skills, my career took a trajectory to the sky. So I promise you very little, but I will promise you this. If you focus on your communication skills, you will wait and watch what happens to your career. Because it's the great communicators that will make the future. So thank you so much for inviting me in and having me as part of your Toastmaster meeting.